the DeFUD Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the DeFUD Podcast. In this episode, we are honored to have Timothy Youngblood, who's been a successful CISO for 4 Fortune 500 companies, including T-Mobile and McDonald's. More recently, Tim is an active investor, advisor, and a CISO in residence for Security, which is a company that provides solutions to secure the non-human identity ecosystems. Welcome, Tim. I have with me Nancy Wang, my co-host, and we'd love to sort of ask you a couple of questions given your unique background, specifically for practitioners and startup founders. So let me start by asking probably a rhetorical question, but we'd love your hot take on this.
Sure.
Do you think much has changed in the last 10 years with respect to what keeps the CISOs up at night?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. The last 10 years, so much happens in 2 years, much less 10 years. But I'm thinking of this meme that I've used for probably the last 5 or 6 years, and it's a CISO who is in a bed in a stick figure, and you have the CEO that's in the bed, you have the CFO that's in the bed. CEO is all sort of straight, the CFO is curled up, and then the CISO bed is completely empty. Right. So that is kind of the state of the nature of the CISO today. And it was that way when I first found that meme, 5, 6 years ago, and it's even more today. I think when you start to look at just the last few years, going back to 22, the same issues that you had in 2022, 2023 are still the same problems you have in 2024, frankly. The majority of attacks that are hitting companies today are from the origin of phishing, they're ransomware based and API attacks, right? So 90% of attacks occur via phishing attempts. And, ransomware continues to have variants that are impacting companies in multiple ways. And it's not always pay-based. A lot of times it's extortion and destruction-based, right? And they're trying to impact an upstream customer or an upstream partner. And then on the API side, we're seeing just more and more APIs explode throughout companies as more of that development happens in the cloud, and there's more connection between companies, and there's exposures that are happening on the back end, and they're subject to token authentication issues that most API gateways just don't catch. So you're seeing those same issues be the themes year over year over year. Now, what's emerging now that I think is keeping a lot of people awake is just in the arena of generative AI and LLMs, right? So there's a lot of concern around proprietary data leaks via LLMs. And these are things that DLP and CASBs just don't do a good job of catching, right? And then I think this year in particular, I think a lot of CISOs are concerned about nation state attacks, right? And then their critical infrastructure being impacted. I mean, this is an election year, and we could be disrupted in many different ways. And so it's a heightened concern for most security officers. And then I think what's evolved now is the last 5 to 10 years, companies have been putting more and more workloads in the cloud. And they've been doing this at a rapid pace. And now there's this concern about the resiliency in the cloud, right? So as more and more and more data got dependent on cloud infrastructure, nobody went back and addressed their BCR plans. And they're still the same. And they're not cloud ready. And people are starting to figure that out in the middle of a crisis, which, definitely is top of mind for CISOs today.
Yeah, I think the BCDR story is definitely interesting because it's very hard to define the boundary of your enterprise anymore. We're all hyper-connected in the cloud, third-party SaaS applications, data moving freely everywhere. Earlier, it used to be like one data center that either you were managing or one single cloud provider. Now the BCDR story is everywhere, and it sort of is directly related to how much leverage ransomware attackers have because they could go in any direction to corrupt your data at that point, right?
Yeah.
So it's an ever-blowing field in that sense. Love it. Nancy, do you have any thoughts? You want to ask some more?
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense, right? You talk about, nation state attacks, and especially in light of the upcoming election year, right? It's a lot on everybody's minds, right? It's not a surprise that the deepfake company Reality Defender won this year at RSA Sandbox. So, moving into kind of defending against deep fakes, right? This brings us to the topic of what a lot of us in the investing world, startup world, as well as security practitioners like Ashish think about, which is how can AI help defenders, right, today? And in your opinion, in 5 years from now, what does that look like as the world moves towards AGI?
Yeah, it's interesting. So as an angel investor, I'm meeting with as many as 10 um, founders a week. So it's a lot of pitches that I hear personally. And I'm also involved in several VC groups, both here in the US and overseas. And I'm seeing a significant innovation progress in early detection at all layers of the technology stack, right? So I think defenders must get into proactive security and detect attacks as early as possible in the cyber kill chain. I mean, that is the name of the game now, right? Whatever helps you get to the source of the issue the quickest and address it is going to be the most valuable tool in your tool belt. And so you're seeing some new frameworks evolve around this, and you're seeing kind of new development sort of structures around things like DDLC, which is data development lifecycle, which is actually looking at the development lifecycle of how databases are covered, which is nearly the number one crown jewel for most companies today, right? Data is the new currency. So, how are we developing our data structures? What's the protection element around that? So there's a whole new sort of structure that's being built around that called DDLC. And it's interesting, and it's all about trying to get course detection as early as possible in that process. And then you're also seeing things like application detection response, ADR. So that's a whole new sort of area of security detection, focusing on sort of applications. It's playing back off of XDR and what we've seen in that whole space of EDR, and now it's really focused in on, okay, what's happening inside the applications and what can we do to detect the problem sooner, faster, quicker. And then I think it gets to where the new
I see
perimeter.
Daniel Schechter at Migos Security has gotten to you.
Yes, he
Actually, when he
has.
came
Yes.
up with when he
Yeah.
came up with ADR a couple of, or actually might have been a year now. I
Yeah.
remember I was on the couch at Icon. You can ask him about this. I was like,
Okay.
oh, bold, coming up with a new acronym, very bold.
Yeah, I met him at Wild Ventures actually earlier this year, when they came through Seattle, and I heard his pitch, was actually kind of impressed with and agreed with that as sort of a new layer that needs to be developed. And then, of course, one that's been around probably the last year and a half, 2 years is ITDR and identity
Yep.
detection and response. And I mean, identity is the new perimeter. I won't even say it's new, it's the current perimeter that's been around for a while. And what are we doing to kind of assess active threats as identities are kind of proliferating across enterprises today? So it's great to see these innovations. I think that's the phase that's coming and evolving and becoming important in the security stack today. And attackers continue to have the advantage, though, right? So they get to pick the pace and velocity of vulnerabilities that they discover. And they've got the ability to pick the time and the place to do it. There's low barrier of entries for attackers because, what does it take to go and sign up for a attack as a service, right? It doesn't take much for one of these things. And they're designed to execute quickly. And basically, the attackers have the advantage of persistency. They just need to wait until you make a mistake. That's all that needs to happen, right? You got, one connection you're trying to make with a third party. You're trying to deploy some new platform. You miss a patching cycle. That's the time they get you.
Right on. I guess more recently, this whole idea of public companies need to report security incidents to SEC. I think generally speaking, my point of view has been it's got a basis in good intent, for sure. Security cannot be bottom of the mind for the leadership team of a public company. And by creating this accountability, I think it raises the level of awareness and urgency on fixing security issues. But I'm also hearing a lot of noise around practicality of this requirement and some confusion around what constitutes material risk, what constitutes an incident, and what is the right format to report. And I think given your vast experience at public companies and now listening to the media and some other practitioners, it'll be good to get your perspective on, how do you process this? How would you give advice to other practitioners, such as myself, on how to think about this?
Yeah, absolutely. And from my experience on not only being on the operational side, but now being on boards, I've been on a public board before. I'm used to being sued, okay, from that perspective, right? So that kind of comes with the territory. And I think a lot of systems are starting to understand, okay, if I'm going to be in this role, I got to be prepared for the potential risk of being targeted from an event, whether it was my doing or not, right? And so my advice is always for CISOs to protect themselves. Ensure you are listed on the D&O policy, right? So if you don't have that or something equivalent to D&O as a lever of protection, then you need to think twice about being enrolled, particularly at a large enterprise, I would say. And then as part of that, your contract, you need to ensure that you get support for your own general counsel, right? And your own sort of liability. I think we're seeing that sort of play out with what's happening with my old good friend Tim Brown at SolarWinds. I've known Tim, going back to 2014 or so. And I've definitely followed his issue. I've had a lot of conversations with him. And it's unfortunate that he's going through what he's doing, but it's actually showing a lesson, right? If you're going to be a CISO, these are the kind of things you're going to have to deal with. When it comes to disclosure, I think it's really important to define what are your triggering points for disclosure, right? What's the criteria for reporting what is material? And then you've got to have that documented someplace in policy. And I look at the first quarter after this guidance from the SEC came out and who actually reported. And most of the companies that reported, they reported, but they admitted they didn't have a material incident, right? I think there was one company that stated they had a material issue. And so, do you really have the criteria set to what is a material problem? And then probably work closely with your general counsel on the criteria for opting out. So a lot of people don't realize you can opt out of that disclosure too. But you've got to have some really specific criteria that you've documented on what your options are reporting out. And you work with that with your general counsel and regulators on agreeing what that criteria looks like and what makes you as a CISO as well as the company legally defensible. So the other thing that I look at too is like you really have to have a line of independence, and this has become really important, I think, in being in this role. And there's got to be some line of independence between you reporting to the board and to regulators itself, right? There shouldn't be a barrier between that per se, right? So
Yeah.
if you're about to take a job as a CISO, you should ask, will I be able to directly speak with board members? Can I have a communication path to the board that doesn't include having to report through someone else? And can I have board sessions alone without the rest of management being there? Is there a problem for that? And if the answer to that is a no, that's a red flag, right? So it's something you need to reconsider because you don't want your message on describing and determining how risk is managed to be muted or filtered through someone else. And then, you sort of still take on the blame of what happens.
Yeah, fascinating. I think this is a very hot topic, and I think the dynamics between the regulators, the board members, the company leadership, the CISO, and their own team continue to evolve around this vector of the frequency, quality, content, and the urgency on the risks. It's a mind-blowing piece of matrix that I think everybody has tried to navigate in various ways. It's exciting times. I think the world is evolving for the better, I guess, in the end. I think related to this idea, I think Nancy, you and I have previously discussed, maybe you can sort of dive into, there's a lot of startups coming up in the ecosystem and you see a fair share of them, Nancy. Maybe we can sort of ask Tim around, we see feature companies in the startup world, and then we see platform plays by existing players. But what is it that you both are seeing? I think this is a question for both of you, net, in the sense that are there meaningful contributions that you see from the startup ecosystem, which have a direct effect on the asymmetry between attackers and defenders? This is what I grapple with sometimes. I see a lot of point solutions, but how do I use them to close a major gap of asymmetry?
Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting question too, because you see the big platform players like Cisco, Palo Alto now saying, hey, we want to serve our customers from cradle to grave, right? We don't want you going off and buying all these point solutions. And you saw that with Palo Alto and Nikesh, going after the acquisition that they've targeted early this year. And I think you'll see more that these big infrastructure companies in particular want to be one-stop shops, right? And, try to defend the most critical issues for their customers. And the question is going to become, from a CISO perspective or just from a security stack perspective, do you trust them, right? Do you trust them to keep that? And does it make sense for all of your, critical protection capability to come from one company? And, there's some dangers in that. There's this whole concept called defense in depth. And there's a reason why that has sustained for, decades now, right? Because eventually your security vendor is going to fail. That's just, it's going to happen. So, how do you ensure that, that you've got the right kind of layered security and investing in one partner, will they be able to provide that? I think Microsoft has tried to do that for years and just hasn't successfully been able to hone that message. They do very well in some areas, but there are other areas that they lack tremendously.
Yeah. And to what we're, I think, just talking about before, right? Startups have that unique advantage that they can innovate really, really quickly. To your point on what you're seeing with ADR, right? Application detection response. Even if you go to the generally thinking about incident response, right? Automating that process. If you look at Gem Security acquisition by Wiz, right? Part of it was following that thesis. So there is something to be said. I'm sure, Ashish, right? Your ears are burning as, currently a CISO in place, right? I'm sure it's easier for you to purchase, one SKU, right? Have one dealing with one vendor that offers all these capabilities instead of having to manage across different capabilities. But what I'm curious about, right, is from both your and Tim's perspective, when is the tide going to swing the other way? Right? Because otherwise, from an investor perspective, I'm now speaking to all the VCs out here, what you're effectively talking about then is a valuation cap, right? Or an exit, sort of one path to an exit, which is to one of these big platform players. When is it going to be, again, the age where we can build the new Zscalers of the world, right? Or the net new Palo Alto networks? Is Wiz the only one of this generation that we're going to see, right? I mean, as an investor, I like more options, right? Optionality is my friend.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too. I was having this conversation with a board member last week. And, if you look at all of the great security technology is come from Israel for the last, 10, 15 years, right? And, there's one company that really has shown some sustainability in becoming a large player in this space on a significant scale with sustainability, and that's been Checkpoint, right? If you go beyond that, it's kind of hard to find someone else who, with all the great technology that's come out of that area, that's become a huge player. SentinelOne has sort of made a big jump, but there's some debate whether SentinelOne's going to have the sustainability to really become another Checkpoint. They've made some good acquisition plays, and I think arguably you can say that with Wiz. It's still early to tell. It's difficult to say, okay, why not? I think, some of it is trying to think bigger and broader beyond, what you do today. And it takes definitely some visionary sort of insights to think about what you're not good at and figure out how do I add it to make me better. And, and I think, what Wiz has done with Gem is a great example of a start to that, but it's hard to tell what it's going to look like a few years from now.
Yeah, I think at Microsoft, we learned a phrase courtesy of Brett Arsenault. Security is always broken at the seams. And when I look at this hodgepodge of smaller companies trying to solve point problems and these larger companies trying to acquire them and then offering a platform, it gives a perception of completeness, but they're always still broken at the seams. Left doesn't know what's happening on the right. And this was very evident in a large company because you're trying to solve a piece of the puzzle, but then you're not necessarily thinking about the interface or the API between one piece of the puzzle and the other piece of the puzzle. And this is where I think I tend to lose most of my sleep because, first of all, I have to fight for the money and effort for each puzzle. Then I have to fight for the money and effort for gluing them together so I can get a pretty picture. So something's got to give in the ecosystem of startups and big players that they make this as a priority. And if that doesn't happen, I don't think we're reducing the asymmetry between attackers and defenders. We're still grinding the wheel, so to speak, in that sense.
Agree with that. Although, we talked a little bit about AI, right? And where it's going and how that may have an impact on what we do. And when I look at kind of the use cases that are happening today in that space, I mean, it's the whole co-pilot thing, and the LLMs that are out there are great at generating code and creating some automated task. And I think it's great for like junior analysts and what they need to accomplish and making them more efficient. And, you have the vendors who are starting to integrate that more into their platforms. But, I think a lot of this is them focused in more on differentiating things and creating things that can help explain things quicker, right? To make people react faster, to get to that proactive stance, right? And then, how do we get those companies to integrate more of that, make it more effective? And then I think as the amount of data that grows, right? We've seen that decade over decade. Now it's like, the rate of change in data is growing leaps and bounds almost year over year now. And these LLMs are now taking advantage of that. When do we get to the point where we trust them to allow them to take the actions themselves, right? And I've been waiting for, a big player more or less, but, maybe an evolving player that can leverage one of these models to understand where the risks are in your environment and then allow it to do something about it, right? And it actually address it, or at least put a compensating control in place until it can be addressed. And I think when we get to that point, I think that's going to be a tipping point on involving the next big players.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think AGI holds some promise, but the change management and the general resentment around, can I trust this system to make the right kind of change for me? Once we cross that barrier, I think we're going from level 1 autonomous to level 4 autonomous. I think we have some hope between reducing the asymmetry between attackers and defenders. Yeah. And with that note, we're right about at time. We want to keep it on time. Any parting thoughts from both of you before we wrap it up?
Oh, go ahead, Nancy.
Sure, Tim. I was just going to say, personally, I'm really kind of nervous, anxious, excited, I guess, about the election and what that holds, not just for, I guess, what nation states will have good, bad, / anywhere in between relationships with, but also what that holds for the economy. Right. And so both as an investor, someone who works with my portfolio companies to place amazing operators, right, helping operator friends find roles. And that's something that is certainly very top of mind for me. Tim?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you talk about elections. I remember back in 2016, somebody was asking me what I'm worried about. And the first thing that popped out of my mouth was the Russians, right? So, and how right I was back then, even though I wasn't sure how that was going to be executed against. But, it's interesting because I think at this stage, there's a lot of great cybersecurity talent that's in the market today. But you don't seem to see as many places for them to go, even though we have this, this huge chasm as far as resource need. But I think I'm a little concerned about, okay, how do we take advantage of this talent that's out there, and what's the right thing for them to do, right? And so it's just interesting to see how AI is going to kind of impact that as far as determining what's important today. There was a point in time where having development skills mattered. I don't know if it matters anymore, right? So what is the skill set that does matter so that we can get these folks that are kind of out and active in the market busy again?
Yeah, I think I'm going to drink to that last note tonight and think about it further. So with that note, I really want to appreciate and thank you for the time, Tim and Nancy.
Exactly. Thanks for coming on to DeFUD with us.
Yeah,
absolutely. It was my pleasure. Great conversation. Thank you, guys.